Okay, good morning or evening, depending where you're joining us from. And welcome to the second Pretoria-Marburg Queer Conversations. Today's session is hosted by the Center for Human Rights, and it will be moderated by myself, Taruna Naidu. And we will be discussing threats to human rights for LGBTIQ plus communities with a specific focus on hate crimes and conversion therapy. So this sixth event series is named The Scholarly and Activist Perspectives on LGBTIQ plus Lived Realities in Africa. And the idea was to create a monthly space for in-depth discussions on topics such as queering coming out, looking at colonial legacies of anti-LGBTIQ plus rights, and looking at queering perspectives on power dynamics. And these sessions will bring together legal scholars and scholars from the social and cultural sciences, as well as LGBTIQ plus activists who have a wealth of experience in seeing how the approaches to rights mobilization has evolved over time. And they will shed light on, particular topics from their own professional and personal experiences. So this series is put together by the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender and the Center for Human Rights based at the University of Pretoria in partnership with the Center for Conflict Studies at the Philipps University in Marburg, and is supported by the Center for Gender Studies and Feminist Futures, which is also based at the Philipps University of Marburg. And today we have with us two panelists who are both very well experienced when it comes to looking at threats to human rights for specific communities such as the LGBTIQ plus community. So our first panelist is Kanye Fariza, who is the Africa Advocacy Officer at Outright Action International. And Kanye is based in Johannesburg, South Africa. She is an international human rights lawyer focused on equality, non-discrimination, and access to justice in Africa. She has vast experience working in regional and international organizations in a range of countries in Africa and Europe advancing human rights. And we are very excited to hear her inputs as to how LGBTIQ plus lived realities in Africa combat and deal with conversion therapy and how it affects this community. And then secondly, we are also joined by Professor Anton Kok, who is based at the Department of Jurisprudence at the Faculty of Law in the University of Pretoria. Prof. Kok is a professor with the Jurisprudence Department and has completed his doctorate in 2008, focused on a socio-legal analysis of the promotion of equality and prevention of unfair Discrimination Act of 2000, which is an act in South Africa which provides the implementation framework for the equality clause in the Constitution. So Professor Kok was appointed as Deputy Dean of the faculty in 2010, and over the years has lectured many law students in jurisprudence, including myself. And he is one of the foremost legal scholars on the Pepuda Act, and he will provide a scholarly perspective on LGBTIQ plus lived realities in Africa with a specific focus on hate crime. So I think I would like to introduce Kanye to begin with her presentation. And Kanye, you have 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Taruna, and thank you so much for the organizers for inviting me today. Very excited to be here. I hope my screen is visible, Taruna. Please let me know if my screen is projecting.
Yes, it is.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, great. So as Taruna has introduced me, my name is Kanye Fariza, and I'm an Africa Advocacy Officer at Outright Action International. Outright was founded in 1990 and is headquartered in New York. We are one of the leading NGOs that is dedicated to improving the lives of people who experience discrimination and abuse based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And we do this by strengthening the capacity of LGBT movements across the world, documenting violations, and engaging in advocacy at various levels, including the United Nations, regional human rights systems, and we partner with civil society organizations all over the world. Today, our conversation is focused on conversion practices in Africa. And we will discuss this, focusing on the lived realities of LGBTQ people in Africa. So I would like to share some of the data that we have found through our research in 3 focus countries, which are Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. We started research in 2019 with, together with local organizations within these countries to really try to understand the nature, the extent, and the impact of conversion practices in Africa. We wanted to build a body of localized knowledge of exactly what these practices look like in Africa, and in particular in these 3 countries, especially because of such a lack of such data. There's just not enough of it, and where it does exist, it's not localized, it's not by us, for us. So it was important for us to try and collate that data and build that evidence of what these things look like. The other objective was to raise awareness, to say that these practices actually do exist in our continent, and they exist in our countries, and they are very harmful to LGBTQ people all over the continent, especially young people. As we know, the continent is a majority youth, and so many young people are affected by these practices. So it was important for us to try to raise awareness of what these look like. And then also to build a broad base of support from various stakeholders, including policymakers, government actors, civil society, people in the African Union, the African Commission, and various other platforms to build a body of support to say these practices must be eradicated. And so I will start off with a very powerful quote, which was shared with us by one of the respondents in our research. And it reads, "It is already difficult to live in a world where everyone thinks you are different and need to be fixed. We are also human beings and did not choose to be who we are. As much as a zebra did not choose its stripes, black and white, it is not by choice, it is by birth. Love us, hate us, we will forever remain queer. Love that child, love him unconditionally, and they will conquer the world with your love and support." So this quote really stood out for me because I think it shows a lot of the pain that many LGBTQ people in Africa carry with them and live with because of being subjected to these harmful conversion practices, and also just living in fear of being exposed to them, and also just being at high risk of experiencing these practices. Our local partner here in South Africa called their campaign Inxeba Lami, which focuses on conversion practices. And Inxeba Lami means my wound. And it really depicts this pain that so many LGBTQ Africans live with and walk through life with. And we were celebrating International Day Against Homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia recently. And unfortunately, in many countries in Africa, there are still frameworks that are discriminatory and actually fuel these harmful practices that many young people, young and old, in fact, are at risk of experiencing or do, in fact, experience. So what are we then talking about when we refer to conversion practices? And there are several different terms that are used, the most popular of which is so-called conversion therapy. And many survivors of conversion practices have said this is a very harmful term to use because there's nothing therapeutic about conversion practices. They are just purely harmful, and there's no therapy that comes with it. So the different terms, as you can see, are on my slide there, but all of them really depict any and all treatments, practices, or sustained efforts that aim to suppress or change a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. It is rooted in the rejection of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer, considering them as needing to be cured or repaired to gain their presumed heterosexual identities. I've put a picture there of a documentary called Cured, which is really powerful and tells the story of America and its journey in trying to eradicate conversion practices. I highly recommend that documentary, and really just describes what these practices look like and some of the efforts that have been adopted to try and eradicate them. But here in Africa, I would like to share some of the key cross-cutting findings on conversion practices that we found in these 3 countries. I won't really go into great detail about the methodology used in collecting this data, but the primary methods that were adopted in all 3 countries included survey questionnaires, face-to-face interviews, focus group discussions as well. And then the secondary data collection method included desktop review of legal documents, civil society reports, academic publications, news, and media publications. And as I have said, there's unfortunately just not enough out there on what these things look like on the continent. Our research found, though, that out of the 2,970 LGBTQ respondents from these 3 countries who were surveyed, more than half of the respondents indicated that they had undergone some form of conversion practice. And those are very big numbers that, you know, in this group, so many people have in fact gone through these practices. And when you think about Africa and the majority of people, over 70% on the continent, being young people who also could be at risk of these practices, especially in countries where there are frameworks and laws that are discriminatory against LGBTQ people. So we also found that frequently several forms of conversion practices are combined. Most respondents in the survey indicated that they endure more than one form of conversion practice. And in the next slide, I'll talk through some of the forms of these practices that exist. And we also found that they increase in intensity from the time a person is outed or is discovered to be a member of the LGBTQ community. First, it would start with family talks, and then it escalates into counseling by church leaders and community leaders, and then it gets into violence in many cases, and duress and ostracization, starving, torture, and various other forms, which we'll talk about in a moment. Conversion practices are also often perpetuated over a long time period. Some of the respondents, for example, have said that they started experiencing these practices when they were children. So we found that they don't even stop until a person has affirmed that indeed I am now heterosexual or I have changed and so on. So they are sustained over a long time. So when we talk about the forms of these practices, we found many cases where people said they were subjected to some form of talk therapy. An example here is a quote from one of the respondents who said, "I was caught in the act having sex with my boyfriend, and I was taken to our local counselor in Machakos Hospital. I was forced to be screened for mental health issues, later to be subjected to daily counseling sessions by my counselor. My dad would later scare me that he would kill me if I don't stop being gay and out me to the whole community." So that is that experience of talk therapy, where there's also a risk of physical violence that lingers. But also we see how even in a medical fraternity or medical space of psychiatrists, psychologists, these practices exist. Especially in East Africa, there were many sort of examples of this. Another example, which was very often found in all three countries, very dominant, is prayer and laying on of hands for healing. This person says, I was told that being gay was demonic and that I need spiritual intervention to cure the homosexuality spirit. I went through many prayers, and at some point I'd contemplated committing suicide. I almost lost myself. So this person also showing some of the impacts of being at risk of or being subjected to these conversion practices, where people have a lot of mental health consequences. Another example is false imprisonment by locking persons in homes, churches, or camps. We also saw cases where people were forced to fast and basically deprived of food for a long time. This person says, my parents locked me in the house. I could not go anywhere. And every night they would pray for me not to be homosexual. This happened when I was expelled from school for being lesbian. This continued for like 3 years. They also invited a pastor from church. I had to go for 5 sessions in a month. So again, there we see a combined use of these practices, but also over a prolonged period. And unfortunately, we came across quite a number of these examples. Another example we found is coercion into sex, relationships, or marriage. And also we found examples of various forms of sexual assault that were used on many people as some form of conversion practice. This person said, I'm a Muslim. So when the parents realized I am gay, they went and paid dowry for a girl they wanted to marry me. She would later be brought to my room for me to sleep with her. I ran away from home. So this is one example where a person was forced into a marriage. We also came across many examples where people, so-called corrective rape cases, or people are forced into sexual intercourse and that kind of thing. Very many examples of beatings to enforce conformity. This person says, when my parents realized I was queer and I loved girlish clothes, I was taken to a pastor where my mom used to go to church. They used to pray for me, and at some point I would be beaten by my brother and father to change and man up. So again, many examples of these beatings that people are subjected to in order to change them. As I said, medical interventions by psychologists and psychiatrists. We came a lot of evidence of that, especially in Nigeria, for example. And then also, again, as I mentioned, rape and sexual assault. Insofar as perpetrators and initiators of conversion practices, the research found that in all 3 countries, religious leaders, mental health practitioners, and family members were the main perpetrators of these conversion practices, whilst family members were the initiators who, once they discovered someone's sexual orientation, they now initiated and approached various actors to try and change this person back. So we also concerningly found that there were many cases where people sought out these practices, where people took themselves to these spaces. And that just showed the need for advocacy and affirming services and awareness raising for people to understand that they're perfect the way they are, and there's no need for them to seek these practices. But it was concerning that there was all these pressures and all this discrimination that actually results in many people going to seek out these harmful practices. And as I mentioned earlier, there are very many physical and mental health consequences of these harmful practices, which many respondents indicated that they had experienced or were still experiencing, including depression, social anxiety, substance abuse, and thoughts of an attempt at suicide, internalized homophobia, and really feeling that a person is inadequate or they start to hate themselves. There's also deep lasting trauma which affects people's everyday life. And again, physical and mental health issues arise from being subjected to these conversion practices. So many UN experts have confirmed that, in fact, these harmful practices add no value. They are harmful. There is no room for them, and they should not exist. The independent experts on protection against violence, violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity has produced a detailed report which highlights that these conversion practices result in severe pain and suffering and long-lasting physical and psychological damage. Similarly, the Special Rapporteur on Torture has said that these procedures are rarely, if ever, medically necessary and lead to severe and long-lasting mental pain and suffering and can amount to torture and ill treatment. So what needs to be done? My emphasis is that every single person has a role to play in eradicating conversion practices, especially in the African continent. Civil society has a really important role to play in documenting these practices. As I've mentioned, there's just not enough localized data on what these practices look like. So civil society must document them and raise awareness that they do in fact exist. And in fact, when we shared these findings with many policymakers, with the traditional leaders and religious leaders, they were very excited about this research, because they say, now we can actually design programs that are targeted and that can have impact because they are evidence-based. Even us as civil society, we design our programming because we have reliable data on what these things look like. So it's important to continue to collate this data. Of course, there are various other things, including supporting victims and survivors that civil society can do, and so on. Religious leaders also have an important role to play. As we've said, we find that in these spaces, this is where people are in fact being subjected to these practices, but also feel so much discrimination that they are not adequate as they are. So they need to seek out some way of changing them. So religious and traditional leaders have an important role to play in publicly condemning these practices, as well as medical practitioners. Similarly, international community has made it clear through various standards that in the medical space, there shouldn't be these practices. They do not add value. They do not work. So there need to be regulation and prohibition of these conversion practices at the national level through these medical associations, and prohibiting the medical practitioners from carrying out these harmful practices. Governments have an important role to play, but one of the primary things that they must do, as we've seen in the example of Kenya and Nigeria, where there are laws that discriminate against LGBTQ people and make consensual same-sex relations illegal. These laws that are like this fuel these practices, and these perpetrators act with impunity in those contexts. So governments must eradicate laws which fuel these harmful practices, and of course put in place laws that protect people from unfair discrimination based on their sexual orientation as a start. And of course, there are various other things governments must do, including providing support to survivors and collecting data and so on. So I will pause there, and I look forward to being with you all in the struggle to eradicate these harmful practices all over the African continent and beyond, because they indeed cause harm to so many Africans, and they need to be stopped. So yeah, over to you, Thiruna, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kanye. I think, the report really does go in depth to kind of build this holistic picture as to how conversion practices really operate, and concretizing an understanding of the extent of which these harms impact people's well-being, mental and psychosocial well-being, even economic well-being, as we see from your presentation. So I think there will definitely be a few questions coming your way towards the end of the session, but I would now like to hand over to Professor Anton Kok to provide his presentation on hate crimes. And I will be sharing my screen for you, Prof. Folks, so you can please just indicate when you would like me to switch to the next slide. Thank you.
All right, you can all hear me, and you can, yeah, we can stick to that first slide for a bit, and I'll tell you when we can move on to the next one. Kanye spoke about governments having to repeal discriminatory laws against based on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, but often and that's speaking as a lawyer, and I will take a narrow approach today, speaking really from a legal perspective, but with some elements of a social-legal approach as well, as to when we say the law has some role to play in changing mindsets. How do we do that? What role can law play in changing these mindsets? Because often government is part of the problem, that ordinary members of ordinary communities find support for their homophobic views from what government leaders say or from what religious leaders say. So, and then often the police or prosecutors or lawyers themselves are also homophobic. So where do we start to change mindsets? So it's not law has some role to play in this, but I mean all the social sciences will have to take hands in this process. And where do you start? I mean, how do you get governments to repeal these laws if the governments themselves support discrimination against sexual minorities? So speaking to my mind, and I will show you on the next slide, to my mind, conversion therapy in South African law would amount to at least harassment. And once the hate crime bill comes into effect, to my mind, it would be a hate crime and at the very least harassment in terms of the Equality Act. So South Africa has a legislative framework in place that can be used by civil society and members of sexual minority groups, that they can use the law, but there's still no guarantee that when they approach a lawyer or approach the court, that they will necessarily find the relief they're looking for if the mindset of the person who's supposed to give life to that legal protection is also deeply homophobic. So it's religious studies, it's psychology, it's sociology, anthropology, philosophy, history, law. All of these have a role to play in, as Kanye said, raising awareness, at the very least creating safe spaces for sexual minorities where they can at least share experiences between themselves. But if they are, if you are at risk of death, in extreme cases, we had a horrific incident a couple of years back. The deeply loved females of our female national soccer team, deeply loved within her own community, and who had a lot of support in the township where she stayed, but she was still subjected to corrective rape and death, even though she lived in a community that supported her. Within a country, South Africa, that is still, and I don't think there's any argument about it, as in many other countries in South Africa, in Africa, that many or most people living in Africa are still deeply homophobic and hold deeply homophobic views, which is where these hate crimes originate from. So to pass a law to decriminalize these laws, that's going to be a long and hard struggle in many cases, where many African countries have taken the opposite view. From the 1990s onwards, there was a new wave of criminalization, sometimes in the constitution itself. So if the constitution of a particular African country, in explicit wording, make it clear that same-sex marriage is outlawed, for example, it makes it very difficult for civil society to use the courts to make some changes. So it's really what Kanye ended with. That's really the most important point. How do we use academics and activists in various fields? How do we use our disciplines to change hearts and minds? Because that's really, if you can change the hearts and minds, then the laws can change. And once the laws have changed, then you're giving something more concrete to activists. But while the laws that are in place are sometimes explicit about that there will be no protection for sexual minorities, then for the moment, for at least those African countries, for the moment, the hard work will be for very brave activists within communities to speak up, to organize, to find ways of creating safe space. Because it's you, I mean, if as I said, she was a beloved female soccer player, loved in her community, brave enough to speak out, felt supported where she was, lived out and proud as a gay woman, still raped and killed. So it's a long and hard struggle often. So talking about hate crimes from a lawyer's perspective, South Africa being one of the very few countries in Africa that have taken the opposite view, where there are actually laws in place to address hate crimes against sexual minorities. But if you live in an African country where the official line from government or from religious leaders are homophobic, it's a long and hard and very, very difficult journey to make progress. So it's a plea to everyone who's listening, from whatever discipline you work in. How do we change people's hearts and minds? How do we convince people to take the line, as that very powerful quote that Kanye gave, love us unconditionally. To me, it's very ironic that religious leaders are part of the problem, while to my mind, the core message in all religions are love and unconditional love. So to my mind, deeply ironic that religion and religious leaders being one of the main drivers of homophobia, not just in Africa. I mean, that's a common trend in many countries as well. That where you would hope that religion would be one of the sources of the solution, often part of the problem, and then governments also sometimes being part of the problem, and sometimes cynically using homophobia to deflect attention away from other pressing social matters in their country. So it's a very difficult, complicated problem for all social sciences to address the topic of the day: hate crimes and conversion, so-called therapy. Kirana, you can move to the next slide. So we, during in the introduction, mentioned that in South Africa we have the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act that gives life to Section 9 of our Constitution. Section 9 that prohibits discrimination on a long list of grounds. The Promotion of Equality Act, and I highlighted those, specifically define prohibited grounds or include prohibited grounds as sex and sexual orientation, gender, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity not listed by name, and gender expression not listed by name. But the B part of that definition, to my mind, is broad enough to include gender identity and gender expression. You can move to the next slide, Taruna. I mentioned that, to my mind, conversion therapy, at least in South African courts, would amount to harassment in terms of the Promotion of Equality Act. That you can see there on the definition of on the screen. Unwanted conduct. So Kanye mentioned some distressing examples of some members of sexual minority groups who voluntarily went to these conversion camps or conversion therapy. That would be a problem in the definition. But generally speaking, many of those very painful examples that Kanye gave us are clearly unwanted conduct, which would have been persistent or serious and would have obviously demeaned or humiliated or created a hostile and intimidating environment, and that was clearly linked to those young people's sex or gender or sexual orientation. So to my mind, conversion therapy, at least in South Africa, would amount to harassment and you would be able to take the matter to court. But from the examples that we got from Kanye, so young people living in houses or being subjected to this by their religious leaders or their own parents, we're asking a lot again from a lawyer's perspective. So this young learner who's been subjected to this horrific experience must now, on their own account, find a lawyer or go to the Equality Court to lodge this claim against who? Their own parents or their own religious leader. So as I said, it's that very, very difficult problem of where does the law, so law on paper, sure, if this was a question set in an exam for our students, yes, conversion therapy clearly amounts to harassment, but practically, we're asking a lot of that young student. If she doesn't have support in her own community, if there's not an NGO available to offer support, we're asking this young person to, on their own account, go to Equality Court and lodge a complaint against an own family member, which is unlikely to happen. If there is support, and if there are activists that can offer support, yes, sure. Then there's a good chance that some relief will follow, that conversion camp will be closed, that specific religious leader will be told to desist, to never again offer such therapy, so-called therapy, to pay compensation to the young person who was exposed to that, to apologize, so that many possible remedies that can flow from that. But you need a very brave person to go to a court, to put themselves through all of that entire experience again, retell that entire horrific experience again in what is likely to be an intimidating court environment. And that's why I said all the other social sciences have a very important role to play in all of this as well. There needs to be a lot of support offered to claimants going to these courts, not having to go there on their own, having to speak to a clerk of the court that may be very unsympathetic. So there are many other things to take into account as well when looking at the definition, just black letters on a white screen. Easy enough for an academic to say it's clearly harassment and you should lodge this claim at court. That's a very, very easy and comfortable thing to say for me. But for the lived reality is sometimes very, very difficult to imagine that law will be able to solve the problem. You can go to the next screen, Kiruna, the next slide. Another, and this is again from the scholarship, many painful examples of what sometimes happens on school grounds, what young learners are being told there, how they are insulted or what they are called, and then obviously some religious leaders saying some very horrific things about sexual minorities. Here, our Constitutional Court unfortunately amended the definition of hate speech for reasons that I can't quite fathom. They have excised the phrase hurtful from our definition of hate speech. That they have now insisted it will only be hate speech if the words that were used were harmful and promoted or propagated hatred. To me, it would have been a very helpful word to have remained, to have stuck with the phrase hurtful, because our common law still allows for a claim to be brought to an ordinary court where your feelings are hurt, where your dignity is intentionally infringed. That claim still exists. The equality courts, you may approach an equality court without a lawyer present. You can lodge your claim at court on your own. As I said, ideally it should be done with support from an NGO or supportive members of a family. Still a very daunting task to go to court on your own, but at least you don't necessarily need a lawyer to have done that. So for the daily pinpricks, the ugly things that members of sexual minority groups must hear on a daily basis, for whatever reason, the Constitutional Court said that they would not, that doesn't belong in the definition of hate speech, while in a previous case, about 3 or 4 years before that, they acknowledged that the common law, actu injuriarum, where you intentionally hurt someone's feelings, that claim still exists in our law. So to me, there's a strange anomaly. We're not talking, in this case, hate speech here, not talking here of a crime of hate speech being created. This is a civil remedy in a civil court. So on the one hand, to leave the common law claim alive, but that means you go to the High Court and you pay a very expensive lawyer. That claim still exists in our law. On the other hand, where you're supposed to have access to justice, make courts accessible, we have an act that does that. And then for whatever reason, the Constitutional Court says hurtful does not belong in that definition. And we are now just stuck with the common law, meaning that you have to go to an ordinary court with legal representation instead of being able to use the equality courts that are meant to be much more informal, much more friendly. So this is an unfortunate development in our law, that hate speech is not as the definition, the expansive definition, has unfortunately been cut down by the Constitutional Court. You can go to the next slide. Tiruna. We now move to a bill that's been before the South African Parliament for a long, long time, and for whatever reason, they've not managed to put it into, make it an act yet. For whatever reason, it's stuck in the legislative process. And at least gender and gender identity is mentioned explicitly, sex and intersex mentioned explicitly, and sexual orientation mentioned explicitly as grounds for where a crime is committed, motivated by a person's prejudice or intolerance, based on at least these grounds. So there is some hope here for members of sexual minorities in South Africa, that once this act comes into force, that the necessary grounds have at least been listed in the act. From the prosecutor's side, you will need to be able to prove prejudice or intolerance for it to be a hate crime. And then if it is found to be a hate crime, that will be an aggravating factor for sentencing. So someone found guilty of a hate crime will then get a higher sentence. That obviously still does not necessarily mean that offender's heart and mind will now be changed. That person will probably be sent to prison. No guarantee that there's any kind of meaningful rehabilitation that's going to happen in prison. So again, what exactly are we trying by legislating against hate crimes? It's really to take hands with the other social disciplines again and saying we want this kind of offenses to never happen again, and to really use the law almost as a symbolic signifier to society that we want to live in a country that's free of these things. But to just send people to jail for having committed hate crimes, that on its own will obviously not change many, if any, of these offenders' prejudice and intolerance. And you can go to the next slide, Turuna. And then there's, and again here, we're now talking an offense of hate speech. So there's slight differences in the wording. The previous slide that dealt with hate speech, that is a claim that you can bring in our equality courts on your own account. In other words, if the initiative is with the member of a particular community that will have to go to court if they're exposed to hate speech, to lodge that claim with the equality court and get a civil remedy. This definition that's on the screen now, once this act comes into force, this will be an offense of hate speech. The wording slightly differently. Hurtful, you will see, was taken out of the definition. That's not phrased here. So either intentionally, or that whatever words or communication that you used, if that can reasonably be construed to demonstrate a clear intention to either be harmful or to promote hatred. Now, if you, on the previous slide, perhaps we can just quickly go back to the previous slide, Turuna, the one that had and one back again. Sorry to do this to you. One back, there we go. If you look at the yeah, there we are. That's the one. If you look at what the Constitutional Court has done is they've added, when they excised hurtful from the definition of hate speech in the Equality Act, they also added the word "and," that it will only be hate speech if the words used were harmful and promoted or propagated hatred. So just keep that in mind when we go to the slide where we were, Turuna. Sorry to do this to you. So we go ahead to the one on hate speech. Next one. For the moment, that wording is still that the words must either be harmful or promote hatred. Now, it could be based on what the Constitutional Court has done in the Kwalani judgment. It could be that "or" will have to change to "and," which is also problematic. It will still be a crime. It will still be. It will, as I said, the civil law, the common law claim still exists. So there is a remedy in law for offending words, for insulting words, but it will not be called hate speech. It will be, as I said, it will be the common law actu injuriarum, insult to your dignity. That's where you will have to go to get relief then. And at least the correct grounds are mentioned again: gender identity, sex, that includes intersex, and sexual orientation. But the hurdle higher here, the hurdle for hate speech as a crime, higher than what Parliament passed in 2000 when they put the Equality Act into place, where Parliament included the word hurtful. As I said, for me, deeply problematic that the Constitutional Court decided to excise the word hurtful from the Act. To me, it would have made perfect sense to have a civil remedy of hate speech. Call it hate speech, call it by its name. So to allow a civil remedy in a civil court for hurtful words, and when you want to criminalize hate speech, to have a slightly higher hurdle, to me, that would have been a better approach. The way the two definitions read now, much the same, that it has to be words used that either are intentionally used in such a way or that can reasonably be construed to demonstrate a clear intention to be harmful and to promote hatred. On the next slide, I think that's my last slide, a very problematic defense to a claim of, so if you are charged with the crime of hate speech, a very problematic defense to that claim in the last section listed there, 2D, where religious leaders are left off the hook to some extent, that they are allowed, in other words, to preach from them, in their sermons, to make it clear that from their perspective that it's unbiblical, or whatever religious text they use, that they will still be allowed to spread the homophobic gospel, but that will still be allowed and will not be, they just have to be careful that they don't advocate hatred. But if they give a sermon that just falls a little bit short of that, that they will still be allowed to spread the gospel, and a homophobic gospel. So taking Kanye's point again of changing hearts and minds, many deeply religious communities that live throughout Africa who take their cue from their religious leaders. If we still, what hope for changing people's hearts and minds if religious leaders are going to be explicitly left off the hook and still be allowed to preach as to how they see their religious texts. So to me, the crucial question remains, how do we change people's hearts and minds? The law, if in a particular country, if the law is against you, as it is in many, many African countries, where the law is against you, the law as it currently reads cannot assist activists to a large extent. They have to think about very creative ways of using the law, and they have to hope that the judges are on their side. In some countries, the judges are against them. In Uganda, there was an example where a Ugandan court found at least I can give them credit for being very creative, but they found a way of expanding laws to limit the work that NGOs could do in that country. Sexual minority NGOs, they used a very creative way to make the life for NGOs more difficult. So the courts are also not necessarily pro sexual minorities. So to rely on the law on its own is not going to get us there. It's really for all the social disciplines. I'm sorry that I repeat this point over and over again, but to me, it's a crucial point that all the social disciplines have to work together, find ways of changing people's hearts and minds. And from that, all of the other changes will hopefully follow. I hope that was clear enough that there's hope in South Africa. Law offers some hope, but from a social-legal perspective, there are still many barriers in the ways for members of sexual minorities to put all their hope on the law. Is likely to lead to disappointment. That if you do not have strong support from a particular community or from an activist group, if you're all on your own, you live in a small rural town, you don't have legal knowledge, you are faced with homophobic slurs every day at school, it's to expect that kind of person in those kinds of circumstances, to expect the law to come to their assistance is unrealistic. So sure, the Equality Acts exist, and some members of sexual minorities are using our courts, of course, and they are being given effective relief, of course. But law on its own cannot get us there. Kanye's point is extremely important. How to change people's hearts and minds, how to get there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Cook. I think, your presentation has given us a really good understanding as to how the law alone is not able to make all of the interventions that are necessary to promote and protect the human rights of LGBTIQ+ people, but also that there is often a complicated relationship between how specific laws can be used in conjunction with each other to provide the best type of remedies available and the best type of protection available for communities that often may not be legally recognized. I think we're lucky in South Africa that we have such extensive protection that was visualized and is more accessible to us. But I think in states where decriminalization has not occurred yet, or where decriminalization has occurred, but you cannot use, the other domestic legal frameworks to kind of have that recognition that this is a specific class of people that are vulnerable across a wide variety of margins, and their rights need to be protected and fulfilled alongside the rights of other citizens. So I think, in some cases, as we've seen, it's very, especially when it comes to hate crime, it's very important to understand whether the intention or the action of perpetrators is to attack someone based on their sexual orientation or gender identity and expression, or if it's a crime that has occurred where there is no specific relationship, but there are high levels of violence in that sense in the same country. I think South Africa is one of those unique places where we see hate crimes against LGBTIQ plus persons, and we've seen an increased surge in that. But we also see that marginalized groups such as women, queer or straight, also face high levels of violence. So thank you very much for your discussion. And I see that we have a few comments and questions coming in. So I would like to move to the question session and invite all of the attendees. If you do have a specific question, you are welcome to post it in the Q&A box or post it in the chat. So the first comment comes from Federica Masi, and Frederica asks a question for the first presenter, that's you, Kanye. Can the surgery done on intersex people without consent of the person, often in early stages of life, be considered a form of SOGI change and conversion? And the second question for you, Kanye, is, may I kindly ask, this is from Naledi, may I kindly ask what case law or decisions can be referenced for the illegality of conversion therapy? Was it ever legal? So I think, Kanye, I will give you the opportunity to address these questions, and then we will move forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Taruna, and thanks so much for the questions from the participants. Also, thank you so much, Prof. Kok, for your presentation, which I thought was very informative. I certainly learned a lot. Also, just looking at conversion practices, I suppose into three categories of those which involve force and coercion, and perhaps involve minors, and then those that actually don't involve minors or coercion or force, but maybe it's talk therapy or it's that kind of thing. And just looking at how the law would apply, especially in a context like South Africa. And I think that's very important because I hope we'll have more information about this. How does eradication look in Africa if we look at the law, and maybe even especially from I think South Africa is a very good case study. I hope that soon or at some point we'll have really a focus on what eradication looks like legally. And taking into account a case study like South Africa on how we can move to eradication. But over to the questions, I did pop a comment here to Federica's question. And I, as I said, I think it's a very interesting question. And we didn't, I won't say unfortunately, but we didn't come across people, intersex persons as part of our study who had experienced any form of conversion practices. But I've said that if the surgery or that intervention is done with the intention of suppressing or changing someone's sexual orientation or gender identity and expression, then it would amount to SOGI change efforts. But obviously, as you've mentioned, this happens when a person is very small, so it's hard to present that evidence that in fact the surgery relates to changing their sexual orientation. But be that as it may, it's still a violation of a host of different human rights to subject someone to that sort of practice and surgery. Insofar as Naledi's question, whether there's case law and decisions to be referenced on the illegality of conversion practices, I think that, again, Africa, unfortunately, is very, there's not a lot of this data. But various organizations have produced publications, and there are various reports, and there are different countries who have, like Australia, for example, Canada, and other countries which have put in place laws that make conversion practices illegal. And those laws are quite detailed on what actions constitute this and how is that violative. Here, I think that's still developing, and we haven't got, in the 55 countries on the continent, we don't yet have a country that has a piece of legislation which specifically outlaws conversion practices. But there are various examples of that across the world in different countries. And in fact, some countries are even in the process of debating whether or not, like the UK, like Ireland, whether or not they should put these laws in place. So it's always very interesting to see how countries get to that. Thuruna, I don't know if I should touch on the other questions, which I think I could quickly comment on, or I'll pause there until you get to those.
No, please, you can go for it. Thank you.
Sure. I think I saw a comment about the role of academia. I think that was also from Naledi, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So another question, law is progressive, but what role do academics have in disseminating key information? And in our research, we found that there's a really big gap for academia. And there's an important role for academics to infuse these sort of standards in various fields. For example, we found that in Nigeria, for example, many psychiatrists and psychologists said that they hadn't learned, for example, as part of the curricula, about LGBTQ rights or sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and those kind of things. And so there's a very important role, for example, in the medical fraternity, psychologists and psychiatrists, gender studies and law, and all these different areas of study need to be aware of these standards, need to be aware of these violations. Another important thing that Prof. Cox said was, how do we change minds? How do we change hearts? And an important thing there is to humanize the discourse, without necessarily parading survivors. But when people see the people who've experienced this, hear their stories, we've seen that in some cases, there's an awareness that people have, and to an extent there is some change that happens there. And I think somebody said something about about the countries where the law, so in those countries with hostile laws where LGBTQ people, it seems that there's an appetite to there isn't an appetite to change the law because it reflects dominant views of society, and maybe conversion practices are seen as a good thing. And with that one, I think there are a few things I'll mention, which is firstly that there is jurisprudence in Africa that says that just because a majority of people have a certain view, it does not mean it's correct for you to violate rights that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights. Firstly. Secondly, in many of these countries, people are signatories, or the countries are signatories to various UN standards and treaties which bind them to ensure people are not subjected to torture. Even besides being part of a treaty, customary international law binds them not to subject people to torture. And in many cases, these conversion practices amount to torture. And also, being bound by African and international treaties that demand that people must be protected from violence, including the resolution 275 by the African Commission, which says that this must be done. But also we've seen in countries like Ghana, where these new homophobic laws come into play, and they even go to the extent of trying to include provisions which say people must be subjected to conversion practices. And of course, in those contexts, we see that where there's a populist movement that wants to sort of use the LGBTQ people in order to score political points, there's been, trying to say we as the majority agree that people must be subjected to conversion practices. And so that is not good. And also in all these countries, there are LGBTQ people. There are these people, and we've seen, for example, Malawi had its first Pride March where people were visible saying we are here. So it doesn't mean those people must also, are citizens or constituents, are people who also the law must protect. So yeah, I think I'll pause there for now, Thulina. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to read out a comment that we got earlier from Pierre Brouard. And Pierre says, in those countries which have hostile laws against LGBTQIA+ people, it seems to me there is no real appetite to change these laws because they reflect dominant views in society. I would argue that conversion therapy is probably seen as a good thing. Does the pain and hurt of queer people actually matter, actually count? I feel we need a new approach. Not sure what it is, though. So I think, reflecting on Pierre's comment, I think that, we know that, across Africa, that understandings of human rights and how to promote and fulfill and protect the human rights of vulnerable groups is quite controversial, as there are spaces in which there are leaders who decide to kind of stifle the voices of certain communities based on their own perspectives as to how and who is, a conventionally accepted citizen that needs to be recognized by the legal frameworks that they are, following in their country. But I think that, an inclusive approach to human rights would necessitate that you center vulnerable communities and advocate for the rights of persons, even in instances where that advocacy is difficult for groups to do for themselves. It's important to capacitate and build up these communities so that they're able to be a part of the process to craft solutions for the issues that they are faced. I'd like to go back to the chat, and I think that it would be great to hear, Prof. Book, if you perhaps have another view on the question that was posed by Naledi. So there are two questions for you. So the first is that the law is progressive, but what role do academics have in disseminating key information, such as the hidden cases and statistics throughout history regarding intersex people and people that fall outside the prescripts of the biological sex binary? And then secondly, is it maybe time to start having conversations around having laws that place responsibility on bystanders to report hate crimes, especially considering that most murders of LGBTIQ+, and then it cuts off, but I'm going to assume are known by people in these communities, that perpetrators are often individuals that have had contact with the victim prior to these incidents. So I'll pose those two questions to you.
Yeah, so I'm not a criminal law expert, but in South African law at least, the argument will then be: is there on the existing definition of murder, for example, or whatever crime it is that was committed? There's the common law concept of common purpose, where you hold people accountable, where they associate them, even if they don't actively participate, but they associate themselves with the crime, that they can still be found guilty of the same crime. So but you need dedicated police officers, you need a dedicated prosecutor who's willing to take that line, and you need a court that's also pro-sexual minority, that we could, on existing South African law at least, there's sufficient grounds to already hold people present, people who are present and who do nothing, to and at least in some circumstances already hold them responsible, never mind responsible for reporting the crime, hold them responsible for being present and associating themselves with the commissioning of that crime. That the common law concept of common purpose will in some instances already allow those bystanders to be found guilty as well. Pierre's question about international conventions and agreements, again, it depends on the particular African government's worry about being shamed internationally. Because quite right, there's a need, you sign up to some kind of international treaty, sure, you get your political points, or you can tell the world that you are committed to whatever the cause may be. And then some very clever civil society organizations use your signature on that treaty to make some argument in the court. It will depend on what's in that particular country's constitution. So the devil will be in the detail. More than 50 African countries, each with their own constitution and their own national laws. In some instances, having signed that treaty would have painted that particular government into a corner, and they will have difficulty to get out of it, sure. Some constitutions, for example, only prohibit discrimination based on sex. All right, there are international law concepts that international law authority that says sex includes sexual orientation. So if that particular country has a constitution that prohibits sex discrimination, and the clever NGO can use that argument to say by prohibiting discrimination based on sex, that includes sexual orientation, and there's no other clauses in that particular constitution that are pro-conversion therapy, for example. So in some instances, having signed a particular treaty will have real consequences for that government. In other instances, if their constitution has other clauses that explicitly allow for something like conversion therapy, then it's a more difficult conversation again. So there's no one easy answer to just say law will always bring a solution. Sometimes law is part of the problem. In some countries, you need very committed, very brave activists and NGOs in some instances. Where they literally risk death for speaking out and for being visible and for giving voice to their suffering. So we are asking a lot of the members of sexual minority groups, and we're asking a lot of activists and NGOs. And then on the question of academics, of course, yes, that's an obvious alternative way of raising awareness, because this is a long and slow and painful road, and it ebbs and flows. It's not linear progress. You think you make progress, and then there's a setback again, and you have to start fresh. But of course, one safe space one would hope would be universities, at least. Not every single classroom in every school in South Africa will be a safe space, but one would at least hope that universities all will not just tolerate. We're supposed to celebrate diversity, never mind tolerate or accommodate. We're supposed to celebrate diversity. One would hope that all universities can sign on to that and allow classroom discussions, and obviously have committed academics, hopefully not homophobic academics who refuse that line. We had a bit of a debate at our university when we passed our new anti-discrimination policy. All of our study guides must now include a diversity statement where we publicly commit to allowing for an inclusive, diverse classroom experience. Now, to me, it's a no-brainer. Of course, we all commit to that, but there were colleagues who were deeply uncomfortable with having to now put this kind of statement in their study guides. So again, it's painful, it's awful, it's frustrating to have to keep going, to keep spreading the message every single day, to just stay the course, keep looking for avenues, keep finding ways of allowing or creating spaces. There was, for preparing for this lecture, there was quite an interesting article I read on social media, and again, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. If you live in a country where it's really difficult to speak out, to what extent can social media play play a role? To what extent can you set up a private Facebook account or use Twitter or whatever? Is there a way of creating a safe space there? And in some instances, it worked, and in other cases, it led to unintended consequences, and it didn't work the way one would have hoped that they could. But it's to keep on thinking about creative ways to, at the very least in the short term, have safe spaces, supporting environments where members of sexual minority groups can at least give a voice to their suffering, at least feel supported, at least start dealing with their internalized homophobia. Sorry, I'm tearing up now. I'm very sorry.
It's okay.
I have a research assistant and I've had to witness it. We're talking middle class, privileged white female, grew up in a very privileged, just seeing her pain of being misgendered, all the kind of things that came out. And I'm not talking hate crimes. I'm just talking the daily indignities. How she just on a daily basis has to have conversations with herself and supporting friends around her, to feel worthy, to feel loved, and to feel unconditional love. It's not supposed to be difficult. I'm sorry. It's inappropriate for an academic conference, but that's why I've said Kanye's point is extremely important. Why is it so difficult to just love someone unconditionally? Why is it so difficult just to be kind? Why hatred? Why exclusion? Why marginalization? Why not the positive part of religion? If religion indeed plays such a big part in many African communities, why not the love and inclusion part of it? Why the exclusion and the rules and the rigid exclusions? Why that part of religion? Why is it so difficult to spread a message of kindness and unconditional love? Why is that? As I said, I'm speaking as a white heterosexual Afrikaans male, one of the most privileged members of South African society. I'm speaking from that perspective. Sure, it's easy for me to say these things, but it's not supposed to be so difficult to live in or to create and co-create a kinder, more caring society. I've not really answered all the questions, I don't think, but I went on a bit of a tangent. Apologies again, but it's deeply painful and frustrating to have these conversations. These things just shouldn't be happening. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Prof. I think, your frustration is something many of us can relate to who work within the LGBTIQ plus rights sector, because from time to time, depending on what you interact with, in the course of your work, whether it's the relationships you have with people who identify with being a member of the community, or even just, having to engage in research work such as the nature of the report that Kanye's team has worked on, you can see that these are deeply personal stories, and the dynamics between these individuals and the support structures that they have or do not have access to affects them politically, economically, socially. And I think that, these are difficult things to reconcile. But I'm hoping that, during the course of our conversation, our discussion today, we have been able to pick up on different aspects of how we can begin to advocate to better protect the human rights of LGBTIQ plus people. I think, working for the Center for Human Rights, I've come to understand that human rights appear to be a very broad concept that people struggle to relate to. But when you have to explain what human dignity and equality looks and feels like, and how that can be achieved, you understand that there's a lot of technical issues in society that need to be pulled apart, and we need to find ways to bridge into a more inclusive society that is a healthy environment for all of us. And I think, the lives of LGBTIQ plus Africans continue to be difficult as many people who are not privileged face these threats to their human dignity, to their equality, to their bodily integrity. And I'm hoping that during the course of the further events in this series, we'll also be able to unpack some of the issues. We have a webinar coming up later in the year that looks at the impact of race, gender, and class on LGBTIQ plus identities. And we also have one coming up next in the series that looks at the anti-colonial legacies. So I think I will perhaps hand over to Dr. Marielle Rees to introduce the next session, and then we will come to a close today.
Thank you so very much for this amazing discussion. Thank you so much. I will just briefly say a few words about the next session and will warmly invite you to it. It happens on the 9th of June and we'll discuss the colonial legacies of anti-LGBTIQ plus rights in African states. As Runa already said, we'll take up actually many of the issues that we've discussed in the last session and today, such as some of the intersections of norms and legal practices, and focus on colonial legacies specifically in this regard. Our two panelists have a legal background, but they're also renowned activists and will enrich the discussion with their in-depth and proficient knowledge about the situation with regards to Western, Eastern, and Southern African states. The panelists are Monica Tabengwa, who's a human rights advocate from Botswana, who's currently working for UNDP Inclusive Governance Initiative. She's worked for Pan-African ILGA, Human Rights Watch, HIVOS, and HIVOS, specializing on LGBTIQ plus rights all across Africa. And our second panelist is Dr. Adrian Juko, who's a Ugandan human rights lawyer and advocate. He's the executive director of Human Rights Awareness Promotion Forum, which provides legal aid services to LGBTIQ plus persons and engages the police and the judiciary on LGBTIQ plus rights. And he has, beyond that, published widely on these issues with regards to various African states. And I'm very, very excited to have them both at our next session. And thank you again so much for today. And I'll pass the mic back to Theruna for a round of thanks and goodbyes.
All right. So thank you very much, Marielle. I think we are all looking forward to the next webinar in this series, and I unfortunately have to bring this one to a close, but I would like to very much thank Kanye for sharing and educating us about conversion practices and how they threaten the lives of LGBTIQ plus Africans. Prof. Book, I'd like to thank you very much for giving us such a well-structured insight as to how you start from scratch and develop this legislation and how it can be used and how sometimes it may not actually end up providing the exact forms of support that are required. And I think, a big takeaway that we have today from this webinar is that legal shifts alone will not penetrate into society and remove these threats of violence and harm for this community. However, it involves an integrated approach using the different social sciences, using the work of activists and advocacy organizations and groups to really sensitize people, inform them, educate them, empower them with knowledge as to how they can better exercise their rights, and then going higher up to mobilize and apply pressure on the African human rights system to allow for further protections and better implementation of things such as Resolution 275, which are an important tool to at least, inch closer towards the type of future we want to live in. So I think on behalf of the Center for Human Rights, I'd like to say thank you very much to everyone who has joined us today. And also thank you to the Center for Gender Studies and Feminist Futures for supporting this event. And we will see you all at the next one. Thank you.